Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This video is actually a special one I wanted to do since our local art museum, the Frist Art Museum, has two current exhibitions that gave me some interesting ideas for some possible supplementary film programs. And these are just some general titles that came to mind that I think tie into the exhibit themes very well. The first exhibit, the main exhibit, is the unfortunately closing in January, so you have a little bit of time to see it if you want to. But of course, it has been at other museums, and I think will continue to some others throughout the country. But it is the exhibition American Art Deco, Designing for the People, 1918 to 1939. And just looking at that exhibit just made me start thinking of so many different classic films, and of course many films made in the years since set in that time period and that affect the Art Deco style. But in pulling this together, I realized there were so many films that you could label this under in terms of being Art Deco films that it got bigger and bigger and bigger. So I tried to focus primarily on films made within that period and also films where the design and the Art Deco was maybe not necessarily an emphasis, but you can feel it a lot more. So some of these films are not the ones that are going to pop up on all of the lists, because there actually are a substantial number of Art Deco film lists or films that feature Art Deco, which most of those are in here. I already kind of thought of most of them, but then there are some where it just occurred to me that there are a lot of Art Deco elements, and it gives sort of a lived-in feel, I think, with certain films like this that you, again, wouldn't necessarily pigeonhole as being Art Deco, but I think they have enough of the flavor to count. So to just run through these very briefly and talk about some of the best ways to see them, because while streaming is convenient, it is by no means the best way to see most films. To start with, a film generally labeled as science fiction, but a huge, enormous influence, I think, on what later became known as Art Deco. And of course, this is one of the most influential films ever made that I think everyone and their proverbial brother has ripped off at some point or another. And that, of course, is the Fritz Lang-directed masterwork Metropolis, here on the beautiful British import Masters of Cinema release with the beautiful sideways slipcover. This is a landmark in so many different ways, but from its design perspective alone, it had to be on this list. And again, it's one of those visual feasts for the eyes that if you've never seen it before, it's like an experience you have to have that first time, and you have to at least see it another handful, 2, 3, 4, 5 times to really unlock everything. And of course, this is the modern restoration that miraculously restored the lost bit of footage that was discovered in a film archive, I believe from a 16mm reduction print. So you can now see the most complete version of Metropolis possible, and the best possible way is to see it on this Masters of Cinema release. It is much better than the US release, much nicer art, and it has a quite substantial booklet, as is common for Masters of Cinema titles, so it is a very substantial release, even though it's still just a single disc. But I couldn't talk about Art Deco and films and not mention Metropolis somewhere. Getting more into atypical choices, these aren't often mentioned, but I think they give you that, again, that sense of Art Deco in motion or Art Deco in the real world, where it provides the backdrop for the events going on. And when you go and look at these films, while they don't have the biggest budgets in the world, and they're still early sound films and thus early talkies, because they're from the wonderful era of pre-code Hollywood where things could be darker and grittier and much more violent, it gives this sort of visceral real world connotation. So of course I had to throw in the initial 3 gangster films that really jump-started the famous gangster cycle, and of course most particularly at Warner Brothers. So of course that means the 1930 and 1931 masterpieces Little Caesar and The Public Enemy, which launched Edward G. Robinson and James Cagney to film immortality. I've got it here, them here on the old MGM double feature Laserdisc, because the Blu-ray set that features them unfortunately doesn't have, nice art on there, but the Blu-rays are the technical best way to see them in terms of picture quality now, but wanted to have something to represent the art a little bit. And of course, you can't have those two without the immortal third film of the sort of trilogy that jump-started the gangster cycle, which is 1932's Scarface, with Paul Muni, directed by the incredible Howard Hawks, It's a blistering picture, just like Little Caesar and Public Enemy, and all three got banned in many different states and cut and censored, and still pack a visceral punch. But again, the notion of everything is in an Art Deco world because that's the world everybody was living in, and they faithfully recreate that, but not in a very opulent way, in a way that again gives you that sense of the world around these desperate characters. So I think it is important to look at films like this that are iconic, but not always for the design aspects. So that's why I have a couple films like these in this listing that I thought were important to include as well. On the flip side of all that, we have the immortal 1932 classic Grand Hotel, the art direction by the incredible legend Cedric Gibbons, one of the greatest art directors of all time. The film definitely lives up to its title of Grand Hotel. It is probably the first major primary example of course, gathering together as many stars as humanly possible into one picture. It's almost too perfect for words in terms of the experience of lavishness and human drama all in this one central hotel location. And the hotel itself, the set, particularly the grand lobby, becomes a character in the film. It is an entity. So it definitely is one of the shining examples of the design of a film becoming part of its DNA and part of its nature and the experience of watching it. When you come back to this film, it's like you're re-entering the Grand Hotel itself. And this is one of the supreme examples of Art Deco in motion pictures. So this is one of the first films I naturally thought of. This is the Warner Brothers Blu-ray, which is the best way to watch the film now. Has a really nice commentary track, some cool extras, and a really nice lossless mono soundtrack. So this is also very inexpensive. And it will be a film that you will want to return to time and time again. It is one of the classic films of the early sound era, and one of the immortal Art Deco films you should think of when you think of, what are the Art Deco films? Well, Grand Hotel is like the granddaddy of them. Next is one of the classic comedies of the 30s. This is 1933's Dinner at 8, directed by the legendary George Cukor, assembling a massive all-star cast based on the original Broadway stage play of the same name. It is very much a comedy of manners, or a comedy about different social classes in and among the rich and mighty and elite of society. But because of this nature and the surroundings they find themselves in, Art Deco is all over the place. So you could theoretically list any number of 1930s comedies, particularly social comedies or comedies of manners, and they would all be applicable as Art Deco films. But Dinner at 8, I think the surroundings are so opulent and so engross themselves into the events on screen that I think it is a no-brainer to include among films to look at simply for their design aesthetics alone and the Art Deco idea. This is the Warner Brothers DVD, just some nice extras. The Warner Archive just completed a restoration this year, and it has just come out on Blu-ray. I just haven't been able to get a copy yet because they've been keeping up a ridiculously amazing work schedule in terms of restorations and releases. But the DVD is still really solid. But if you're looking to come to this classic 30s masterpiece of the comedy genre, the Warner Archive Blu-ray will be the version you'll want to seek out first. Next is one of the most special films of the decade and of pre-COVID Hollywood, the first of the 6-film immortal series, The Thin Man. Of course, have the 1934 original film. Again, this is one of those titles that isn't necessarily thought of as an Art Deco film, but it's all over the place. And because the film takes place primarily in hotel rooms and apartments and in different classes of society, it's very much just like the Dinner at 8 and other comedies of manners and things. But this moves with a remarkable energy. It started the 6-film series and is the quintessential iconic film of the main pairing of William Powell and Myrna Loy. Probably, I think without question, the greatest male-female team in motion pictures. I mean, they are so completely enchanting and believable as a married couple that, of course, everyone thought they were actually married in real life, which they weren't. They were just great friends, but it kind of drove them a little crazy. But The Thin Man is, of course, based on the Dashiell Hammett original novel of the same name, and does retain a lot of that grit of Hammett, being it is, technically still a pre-code film. The first two Thin Man films have that greater sense of reality and darkness. And of course, The Thin Man is iconic for the amount of alcohol consumed by the not just the two lead characters, but practically everyone in the film. It seems they go from not just corpse to corpse that turns up, but from drink to drink to drink to drink to drink to more drinks, and of course more drinks and hangovers and everything else in between. And of course, the bodies stack up and the one-liners stack up even higher. So if you've never seen The Thin Man, I don't know what you're doing with your life. It's one of the most magical films of classic Hollywood, and you'll fall in love with this film, and you'll want to see the rest of the series, which all are classics. But I think the first two films are the strongest overall, but you can't go wrong with any of them. This is the beautiful Warner Archive restoration on their Blu-ray release. They've been doing each film in the series and will be completing the series just at the start of next year, 2022. They're releasing the sixth and final film, so we'll be able to look at all the six on Blu-ray finally. And these restorations are nothing short of astonishing. They make the Laserdisc and DVDs look like the old discs that they are. They achieved real miracles, particularly with this original film, which was in really bad shape and didn't have very good elements. So if you want to see The Thin Man, or you're coming to it again, please do yourself a favor and get the new Warner Archive disc I've got here. It is nothing short of stunning. It's a must-own Blu-ray. Has a couple of nice extras, but is also available at their usual very low asking price. Moving back into more science fiction territory, this is another that is one of the first things that came to mind. And again, like Metropolis, because it's science fiction, Art Deco isn't the first thing that pops into people's heads, but it is very much applicable. And that is one of the few truly great science fiction films pre the sci-fi boom of the 1950s. That, of course, is the British 1936 film version of the H.G. Wells novel Things to Come. This is the Criterion Blu-ray release with the really bold and striking art. This is, like Metropolis, it's a very interesting mix of science fiction elements, attempts at futurism and imagining what the world could look like, and the Art Deco elements of the time. So it's a real interesting fusion between all of those, and I think that makes it essential for looking at Art Deco's effects on film. And plus, I also tried to think of titles that had really nice Blu-rays or special editions. As I said before, this was based on the H.G. Wells original story. It did try to adhere to Wells's text, which unfortunately most films up to that point really had strayed away from, which drove Wells crazy, primarily films like Island of Lost Souls, even though I love that film and it's great. The Invisible Man in 1933 was the lone exception that actually stuck to his text and improved upon it. Things to Come does stick to his text pretty well. It was produced by the great Alexander Korda and directed by the legendary art director William Cameron Menzies, who did some of the great art direction in films from Gone with the Wind onwards. He wound up directing, two of the notable science fiction classics, one being Things to Come, and the other being the 1953 sci-fi masterpiece Invaders from Mars, which has an incredible dreamlike child's eye view of the world. Things to Come does have a very intricate visual style, and the visuals and the costumes and the sets, again, with that heavy Art Deco influence everywhere, is what you most remember when you think of the film afterwards. And it's a great film to come back to, and Criterion did a really good job with this special edition package. So I thought that was an easy no-brainer to include in this. Then last, going chronologically, since it's getting close to the holidays, it's the perfect time for this sort of film, because everyone always goes, It's a Wonderful Life, but I go a bit further, and I always go back to most of the Frank Capra classic titles. So I felt it was perfect to include 1937's Lost Horizon. where the Art Deco aesthetics, you don't think, oh, well, where would that fit in? But when the characters do arrive at Shangri-La, as they do in the novel, it's an Art Deco palace. It is moving more into the more streamlined, modern side of things, but the actual setting of Shangri-La, which is very nicely sort of grayed out here on this cover, so you just get like the bare bits of it poking through like a sort of mist, hinting at the mystery of the place. When you actually do get to see it, it is a palace to Streamline Moderne and Art Deco, and is very much beloved by various Art Deco societies for the design aesthetics. And of course, the idea that the mythical Shangri-La that everyone aspires to get to sooner or later, the perpetual heaven on earth, is itself a sort of temple to Art Deco design, is, I think, very interesting. And of course, that comes out of this film being produced in 1937. This is the beautiful Sony Blu-ray and the wonderful Digibook with lots of lovely stills. This was restored in 4K, presented on Blu-ray here as part of their matching Capra title collection. I would love to see this come out on UHD at some point. This also has a tiny bit more of actual picture footage. Lost Horizon was very famously cut down, even on its original release by Capra and others, to a much shorter runtime. It originally had bookends like the novel, and those were ripped out. And so it's been part of a very painstaking, multi-decade process to restore the film fully. They've had a complete soundtrack for some time, but they've been missing individual scenes, and they've had to rely on usage of still frames with the complete soundtrack. But for this 4K restoration and thus this Blu-ray, they were able to find really the most crucial of the missing scenes. Even though the quality isn't up there with the 35mm footage of everything else, it's just amazing that they were able to find and locate that. So this is the most complete version of the film and doesn't have to rely on quite as many still frames. It's a very beautiful film experience. It's not for everyone, I will admit. I have showed this to a lot of different people, and it affects everyone differently. And of course, if you've read the novel, I do think the screenplay does improve on the novel in a number of ways, but then there were things the screenplay couldn't fix that were issues in the novel. So it is not a perfect film. It does have issues of its own, and it is understandable to see why it wasn't a success on major terms in 1937, but it is a beautiful production, and I think the aesthetics of Shangri-La itself are complete points of entry for this Art Deco list, so I had to include the 1937 Frank Capra Lost Horizon. Next, I've got a couple films I've broken up into series or genres. The first is a must when you think Art Deco, you start thinking of films from the 30s, and these films immediately spring to mind. I'm of course talking about the iconic Busby Berkeley musicals produced at Warner Brothers with their show-stopping, just jaw-dropping dance sequences that are themselves not only life-changing dreamscapes, but complete works of art. They pretty much stop the film dead and go into complete fantasy overload territory. Warner Archive has released several of them on Blu-ray, so the easiest places to start would be the first film, and probably my favorite overall. I love all of them. I'm not really a musicals person, but the Berkeley films are such showcases of talent, design, set design, production design, performance and direction, actually, because the actual stories are invigorating and actually interesting. It's not all about the songs, but when the Berkeley supervised dance sequences come up, that's when they go into complete legend status. So the first film was, of course, 42nd Street here on the wonderful Warner Archive Blu-ray with original poster art. As usual, Warner Archive has done full restorations on these, so if you want to see these films, the Warner Archive discs are the places to start. Again, 42nd Street has been turned into an actual stage musical now, and it's pretty much become a cliche of a show that's going on the ropes and having to keep it going, but it's produced with such vigor, and again, the actual film itself is a great film and full of that great pre-code energy that infuses the first couple of Berkeley musicals, so you really can't go wrong with either of them, and of course, it's what we all hope that Warner Archive gets to do the rest. They also did the masterpiece Footlight Parade with James Cagney. This has the iconic Berkeley dance sequences and includes his iconic dance sequence that involves an entire majestic, incredible water sequence full of synchronized swimmers you've probably seen images from the many Berkeley dance musical numbers. They've been reproduced in terms of images and books and clip shows and things time and time again, and they've been ripped off to no end. But seeing them in context and seeing these films for the first time, particularly in these two restorations from the Warner Archive, they are works of art, and the Art Deco style is just sublime in these films. So they were all must-sees. Of course, these are the two the archive has done that I have. I'm really hoping they get to do the third film and the sort of opening trio or opening salvo of the first three Berkeley musical films. So you have 42nd Street, Footlight Parade, and The Great Gold Diggers from 1933. Any of those three films or any of the Berkeley musicals will give you a great Art Deco overload. Now we move into, again, a genre most people are not going to think of as being Art Deco, but these were some of the first things I thought of when I decided to try and put this list together of Art Deco films. And that is, of course, Art Deco films of the horror genre. Horror boomed in the 1930s. It became the golden age of horror once Universal started their sound horror films with Dracula and Frankenstein in 1931. That meant all the other studios had to jump on the bandwagon somehow. Some studios kept with the sort of gothic historical period settings of most Universal films. Others decided to take their own route, and Warner Brothers stepped into the fray a few times, most notably in their two pre-code two-color Technicolor horror films, which, because they are pre-code, they have a grisliness to them and a nice bit of almost salaciousness in a way that films after the code came into effect did not have. And they have the traditional Warner's grit and zest for life and the aspects they always strove for of making realistic films with stories that were ripped right from newspaper headlines. So these are horror films that have much more in common with, say, The Public Enemy and Little Caesar than they do the Universal films. So they have a bit of that energy. Of course, talking about the masterpieces Dr. X from 1932 and its sister film, 1933's Mystery of the Wax Museum, produced pretty much back-to-back on ridiculously high-pressure schedules with most of the same cast and crew in each. They really do form a double feature pairing and should always be watched that way. And they are the only two-color Technicolor horror films. The two-color process produces a very eerie sort of color effect since it's only combinations of reds and greens. So you have lots of reds, you have lots of greens, and you have some browns. That is your color spectrum for the most part. And that applied to pre-code horror films, even though they are set in the present day at the time. It gives them an atmosphere unlike any other films you'll ever see in your life. They are one of a kind, and unfortunately they were thought lost for many, many years. And then you couldn't see Dr. X in its color version. Mystery of the Wax Museum was finally discovered. They both only had, one print really from Jack Warner's old archive, and they were in pretty deplorable shape. And then finally, after years of neglect and not having, decent versions, Warner Archive and the Film Foundation came to the rescue along with the UCLA Film and Television Archive and produced these beautiful restorations. So these are must-own titles. They are ridiculously cheap, and the picture and sound restorations on these make them play like better than they were brand new. They are astonishing. Each has some incredible extras, some absolutely essential commentary tracks on both of these releases from Alan K. Rudy and the great Scott McQueen. Of course, both star Fay Wray and both star Lionel Atwill, and both are directed by the legendary Michael Curtiz, arguably the greatest film director who ever lived, who succeeded in virtually every genre there ever was, including horror. These are his two great horror films, along with his 1936 masterpiece, The Walking Dead, with Boris Karloff. But these have a remarkable sense of Art Deco because they are set in the present. They do have the energy and zest of a classic Warner gangster film, but they're horror films, and they're pre-code horror films, so they're a bit grisly, and they're done in two-color Technicolor. So there aren't many two-color Technicolor films that give you that Art Deco feel. So in a lot of ways, because these have those strange elements, they make the Art Deco elements come alive in ways that other films don't, because they're set in the time period, they're made in the time period, they're horror films, they're pre-code horror films, they have fast-talking pre-code characters like any other Warner Brothers film, and they're in the very eerie two-color Technicolor. So their experiences like no other, and I think make great examples of Art Deco in film. And with all those extra eerie elements, they definitely have an additional wow factor that really draws you in. Just like with Lost Horizon, this next film is a title that you wouldn't necessarily think of as an Art Deco film until the characters get to this large estate mansion. So it's just like Lost Horizon in that regard. But this is a horror film, also from the golden age of horror, and also a extremely notable horror film for breaking a lot of taboos, causing a lot of censorship trouble, causing censorship trouble before the film was even released. It was partially reshot, rewritten, reshot again, and with some dramatic changes that caused the narrative of the release version we know to make some leaps of logic. But it is one of the most striking Golden Age horror films you'll ever see. It is a film I like to describe to people as being gleefully and deliriously messed up, and that is Edgar G. Ulmer's 1934 Universal produced version of The Black Cat, here in the beautiful Eureka Masters of Cinema import version that pairs the three Universal produced films ostensibly based on Edgar Allan Poe material, but really all they do is they take the name and some Poe trappings and then they just go crazy with them, and all the better for it because they are beautiful in their craziness. But The Black Cat is the most witty and the most, again, gleefully out there in terms of the elements. This is a film that you can't believe was made in 1934, a film dealing with the ghosts of World War One. Lugosi gets to play the heroic character this time. He's a tragic figure, and Boris Karloff, in their first teaming, which made this film a ridiculous success in 1934, plays the target of his vengeance. This very Aleister Crowley-like figure who lives on a mansion built on the ruins of a mass grave from the old war where they both the Karloff and Lugosi characters served. But he has constructed it in his own design as a complete Art Deco mansion. It is a mansion that is Art Deco to the gills in the middle of this completely incongruous location, and again on top of the site of a great battle and mass grave from World War One. If that doesn't already start to tell you how dark this film gets, that's just the tip of the iceberg. This is a film that deals with everything from, and again, not all of this is explicit, most of it is implied, but it is so heavily implied that it almost could be explicit. This is a film that deals with Satanism and black mass and human sacrifice and torture and murder and death and obsession and psychological fracturing of the mind. It just goes and goes and goes, and then of course you get the nice extra touches of necrophilia and all kinds of other fun stuff. And again, this is the censored, reshot, rewritten, tamer release version. We can only read about how the original was in terms of how dark it got. This is also a film loaded with iconic moments that you have Karloff and Lugosi actually playing a game of chess, ostensibly for the lives of two poor honeymooners who wind up stuck in the middle of this Art Deco estate with these crazy people everywhere, and they're literally playing a game of death in terms of chess. And you immediately think of, maybe, was this possibly an influence on The Seventh Seal? It's also the film where Karloff wakes up in the middle of the night looking like death walking and strolls over to the pipe organ and plays Bach's Toccata and Fugue. So the classic villain pipe organ moment and his supreme moment of villainy, well, it pretty much comes from The Black Cat. This is a film loaded with visuals that you might recognize, and of course you do have Karloff always walking around and prowling around his Art Deco mansion, stroking the white cat. So it's a great film for the visuals, for the style, for the atmosphere. The story does suffer a little bit from the drastic recutting and rewriting, but Karloff and Lugosi give it their all and are fantastic, and the atmosphere of dread is so well done that honestly, of these three films, The Black Cat is probably the most Poe-esque in terms of feeling, even though the story has nothing to do with Poe outside the title. So it is now viewed as an artistic triumph. Back in 1934, it made a lot of money. It raised a heck of a lot of ruckus with various state censor boards, but it was just popular for the Karloff and Lugosi pairing. But Edgar Guillaume really brought some true darkness to the film, and unfortunately, his career got shortchanged, and he wound up making B and B grade films and films on Poverty Row. But The Black Cat is one of his great films, and it is one of the great Art Deco films, even though it's a total gleefully, deliriously over the top, messed up, dark, gothic golden age horror film, and it builds to an incredible climax that is one of the great scenes in golden age horror films, which I won't spoil for those who haven't seen it. Again, this is the Eureka Blu-ray release. I do believe this limited edition is out of print, but you can get the standard version still. It doesn't have the slipcase. It has just a simple case with the slipcase art. They did put together a nice extras package, and the encoding is really good. So you can get this in the U.S. On the Shout Factory Universal Horror Collection Volume 1, but this release is much better for the 3 films than the U.S. release is. But of course, being Region B, you will have to have region-free capability. But this is the best release of The Black Cat in the world, and the commentaries on all 3 films are really exceptional. Then lastly, I wanted to mention 2 animated titles. Again, Art Deco did extend into animation as well, because this is really a golden age for many animation fans, and because it was really becoming the heyday of, everybody thinks of Disney, but it was really the heyday of the Fleischers, who were Disney's main competitor, and they produced in the early 1940s what I think is their masterpiece. And for me, I'm not a full-blown animation historian, although I find it ever continually fascinating. But for me personally, I think this is still the gold standard for all animation. If I was forced to choose what I think is the greatest animated short or animated film or animated anything ever, it would have to be the Fleischer-produced Superman series, which is just about the most Art Deco thing you'll ever see in your life. It may only be superseded by a direct inspiration, something that inspired years later, which we'll get to in just a moment. But these shorts, the first half were produced by the Fleischers, and then they had a company switch up, and the second half, or the last shorts, were produced by famous studios, and there is a little bit of a quality drop-off, and in the later shorts were primarily World War II propaganda film shorts. But that aside, the whole canon of the Fleischer Superman animated theatrical cartoons are just, they are works of art, and they take the Art Deco sensibilities and stylings of the time and fully realize them. That combined with the Fleischers' pioneering use and development, and actually invention of the rotoscoping process, making the animation physically believable and really capturing the sense of motion, makes these shorts just live and breathe, and combined with their vivid use of color and their usage of real film techniques. These are shorts that use chiaroscuro lighting, and you have shadow, and you have detail, and you have actual staging of the characters as if they were in a film. These are like little miniature movies, and they are absolutely perfected in every little instance. And they tell nice little stories. They may be obviously a little concise, and they may, at times, if you watch all the shorts together, they might feel like a cliffhanger chapter serial, but they are just little majestic masterworks of art. They're all incredible, and again, I do really think I still do think this is probably the definitive adaptation of The Man of Steel. This is still early in his career. Of course, Superman premiered in comics in 1938, and these started in 1941. But it was really the Fleischers who helped Superman finally fly. Before this point, he was primarily still just leaping tall buildings in a single bound. And the Fleischers realized this would look silly all the time animating, so they literally asked, "Can we just make him fly?" And the answer was like, "Yeah, sure, I guess." So it's really a lot of the developments made in the Fleischer cartoons and the simultaneous radio series that created a lot of the Superman isms or the cliches or the fundamentals of the character, building on the early comic years that all three combined the basic Superman character we know and love. And of course, these have been so iconic, not just in animation, but to fans for generations and are continually rediscovered. This is the technical best presentation now. This is the Warner Brothers standalone 2-disc DVD set. They did do some beautiful restoration work on these. Again, these look miles better than all the old public domain versions. These shorts have a bit of rights gray area, so they've been kind of in the public domain for a long time, and then Warner's did this in the mid 2000s. Unfortunately, they haven't brought these to Blu-ray yet. These would look astounding in 4K. I mean, these have animation cells. You could take any frame of one of the Fleischer Supermans and hang it on the wall in an art museum, and it would just totally knock you down. They are that beautiful. And then seeing them actually move and seeing these characters come to life. When you first see Superman fly in one of the Fleischer shorts, it's in the original, in the very first short, literally called Superman. When you see Superman take flight for the first time, the way he builds his energy and like literally lifts off from the ground, and the way he moves in the air, I mean, it's just majestic. But unfortunately, they did make some audio errors in the Warner restorations. Some were corrected for this. These shorts were also included in all the Superman film series box sets, but unfortunately, not all of them. So I do still prefer, I like having. This is the old Bosco Video Diamond Collection on DVD. These were all transferred from 35 millimeter prints back in the I believe this was originally done for VHS back in the early to mid 90s, and then they transferred it to DVD. And so if you want the sort of warts and all presentation in terms of how these shorts would have looked if you somehow got to see them in a theater or somehow found an unfaded original print, this is your best bet, and all the audio is correct. But of course, these are not restored beautifully like the Warner Brothers set is. So I like having both of them, and I have done a pretty good detailed research history on the various releases of the Superman Fleischer shorts, and these two releases are the ones you really want to have. Everything else is just kind of extra and is not as good in picture or sound, so these are the versions you want to have. Then lastly, to get to what I hinted at before, this is a film that's a spin-off of a television series, and this is, I think, really, I mean, obviously the great disciple of the Fleischer style. The Fleischer Superman cartoons were the primary influence in the conception of this series that led to this feature film and at a second later. And this series, this whole project became so well known for the style it developed that it wasn't just Art Deco that was a part of this series, but this series took on the Art Deco style of the 1930s, and their whole concept was essentially, what if the New York World's Fair never ended and just kept going? So they mixed in some modern technology with a heavy dose of the Fleischer Superman style and created what is quite possibly the greatest animated series of all time, and is the iconic definitive adaptation of the Batman character. Of course, talking about Batman the Animated Series, the pioneering work that, with its illustration and art actually painted and printed onto black paper instead of white paper, actually created a new type of design that is referred to as dark deco. So this is the only thing I can mention that actually has its own particular subgenre that is linked to Art Deco. And so in the midst of making the series, which ran for several seasons, they wound up making a standalone film that was originally intended for video release, but Warner Brothers decided it was so good they had to just throw it out in theaters. So we got the feature film release of what is still really unquestionably the great Batman film adaptation, the film that gets the character and his world so perfectly spot on that it remains still to this day the great Batman feature film, and without question the great comic book film adaptation, as of course 1993's Batman Mask of the Phantasm. If you've never seen this film, please go and see it. It is a shorter animated feature, but it is better than most full-length features you will see. This is the perfect distillation of everything the creative team of Bruce Timm and Eric Radomski and everybody else on that legendary team of the animated series strived so hard to do. And because it was a special project, they had a little bit more time to really focus on it, to make the story as good as they could. They didn't have to worry about standards and practices in terms of the censor boards of the time and making it fully appropriate for children. So this is a full-on, really adult-oriented story. It is told through a lot of flashbacks. It is hugely influenced by not just the Art Deco style and the Fleischer Supermans, but hugely influenced by the great film noir. So it has many of the aesthetics of what we now know as film noir that they didn't know in the 40s. They just thought it was, they were making crime films. But it is made and structured like a great film noir, with all of the great Art Deco stylings of the series and all of the enormous influence of the Fleischer Supermans. So it really has all the great elements of the series they were doing without the constraints, without the censorship troubles and worries. So this is where they got to really cut loose, spend a little bit more time, and make something as good as they possibly could. And they did it in spades. Again, this is the great Batman film. I love the original for live-action Batman films for different reasons, but in terms of what is the film that really gets the Batman character and his world perfectly, it is unquestionably Mask of the Phantasm. This is the beautiful Warner Archive Blu-ray release. This is the way you will want to see the film. They did a beautiful brand new transfer and restoration job. Because this was originally formatted and designed for 4:3, this was originally just going to be released straight to VHS and Laserdisc back in the 90s. Warner decided they wanted to release it theatrically, and that meant it had to be in 1:8:5. So the animation team had to very hurriedly put a 1:8:5 mask on all the scenes and make sure they worked okay. So for years, we watched it in widescreen, or if you saw it theatrically, some of the shots are a little tight in terms of the framing, so some people really prefer the alternate framing, which technically was the original intent, but either way is perfectly fine. Very fortunately, Warner Archive decided to restore and present both ratios on this disc, so you have the choice of the 1:8:5 theatrical ratio or the 4:3 or 1.33:1 aspect ratio version. Both are original and both have their pluses and minuses, and they actually include a little bit of explanatory text when you first put in the disc and you're looking at which version you want to select. So that way, when you put this in, you don't just sit there scratching your head wondering why there's two different versions of the film. But this is probably the ultimate expression of Art Deco in film. I don't know if there's anything possible that is better than this at expressing Art Deco and the world of Art Deco and building upon that and making that into its own universe. I think, again, the only thing that comes close are the Fleischer Supermans that directly inspired Mask of the Phantasm and the whole Batman the Animated Series crew. So I had to include this. Just thinking about Mask of the Phantasm in terms of Art Deco, it was the perfect thought. So that's why I have it here. That's why it's essential, I think, for looking at Art Deco in films. This list is, of course, by no means definitive. These are just some highlights and some things I thought of as being really notable for their Art Deco design and stylings, and also being a key component of the actual story. And again, I tried to stick specifically to films and productions that were specifically from the 1930s, the lone exception being Mask of the Phantasm, I think, because it is so important and so much of an experience. And of course, again, it basically invented its own type of Art Deco in the dark Deco form. So I felt it had to be included here. But there are, of course, many other film examples. I can't believe I forgot to mention the Astaire and Rogers musicals from RKO, those with their fantastic sets for the dance sequences. So those would be just as important as the Busby Berkeley musicals. You could look at, say, for example, Top Hat or the masterpiece Swing Time and get a great Art Deco experience. So again, this is by no means definitive, but I wanted to put something together after looking at the Art Deco exhibition as I felt I could put together a whole a program list of films. And of course, I came up with way too many, so this is like my very whittled down version. And then move on to the second exhibit at the museum. This one lasts through the end of January, so you have a little bit longer to see it. But it is Medieval Bologna. It is art for a university city. So this is all really amazing pieces from medieval Italy. And of course, it's amazing that, of course, any of these pieces survived. It's a really intricate exhibit if you get the chance to see it, just being able to look at all of these pieces up close, in particular all of the various books that have survived and have been included here. It's just incredible whenever you get to see exhibits like this with such artifacts that you can look at up close and really get the sense of the passage of time. Of course, in films, there's not a whole lot that are specifically set in medieval Italy. Most are going to be in the Renaissance era, and of course there is a definite spillover. The medieval period goes into the Renaissance period, so you could technically include some Renaissance films, but the exhibit is very specifically medieval Italy and a very specific time period. So I tried to think of and focus on at least one or two films that were specifically medieval Italy. And I'm sure there are probably a few more that I wasn't aware of or I didn't think of. But again, it's a much more narrowed focus. So I did think of a number of films, but I realized those were technically Renaissance films or specifically Renaissance films. So I tried to stick specifically to medieval Italy set films, and I could really only come up with two notable examples. So that's why I've included it here, because it's a much shorter a program list than my Art Deco one. But the first is a real underrated gem from 1950, and this was at a time period where historical adventure or swashbuckler films were starting to make a little bit of a comeback, along with just grand adventure films. So for a small period in the early 1950s, there was this little run of swashbuckler adventure films and historical adventure films that were starting to come out. And this one kind of gets swept under the rug by others, but it really holds up well, and of course is set in medieval Italy. That's, of course, 1950s The Flame and the Arrow, which is an early star vehicle for Burt Lancaster, who's really great at the role, and he would later go on to greater fame in this type of film, particularly in The Crimson Pirates, which he actually sort of self-produced as well. What makes this special? Again, it is medieval Italy. You get full, beautiful Technicolor usage, and this was directed by the great, legendary artist, the director Jacques Tourneur, who is one of the great directors of all time and never gets talked about, and he really should. And he brings some of his sensibilities into this. By this point in his career, he had pretty much kind of become a journeyman film director, but his work in this film and his westerns and many other films really is so far above what you get in the average film of this era and this type that it elevates even more mundane scripts into something really special. And this film, again, it is far better than what it should be, and I can't help but chalk that up to the combination of Jacques Tourneur and a young, very eager Burt Lancaster. And this film builds to a really fantastic climactic sword fight, and it's also very notable because it's the only sword fight that I'm really aware of, really pre-Empire Strikes Back, that goes into darkness. And of course, Jacques Tourneur, coming from his legendary work with Val Lewton, all about darkness, and the three horror films they made together, most notably Cat People, but of course also I Walked with a Zombie and The Leopard Man. So those films were all about darkness and shadow. So the fact that the sword fight at the end of The Flame and the Arrow actually ends in darkness, and the only light source is the blades clashing and coming into light every once in a while. It's a really striking visual moment that's really the highlight of the film, that climactic sword fight. Of course, being a 1950 studio historical film, it's not going to be the most period accurate, say, if you were to compare this to a history book, but it is really well mounted, even though it isn't a top-tier, A-budget production. It's really impressive for what it is, and it is actually better than most of the higher-budgeted adventure films or historical swashbucklers that are being produced around this time, when there's, again, a little sort of mini boom on swashbucklers again. This is, of course, the nice Warner Brothers DVD with the original poster art. This is the main release for the film, so it's very easy to find. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the other film I wanted to mention that has a much more historically accurate feeling production design is a much more serious and somber film, of course, but unfortunately this film has gone out of print, so seeing it or finding a copy will probably be a little bit more difficult. It is possible though, so that's why I included it. That is, of course, the 1986 film The Name of the Rose, starring Sean Connery. This is a really great film that doesn't really get talked about very much and is in the perfect period setting of medieval Italy. Is based on the Umberto Eco novel, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I never know if I am. But this is a really great film to come back to. And again, it's obviously much more serious and much more intent on creating the proper period feel than the previous film. So I thought it was great to have sort of the 50s studio version of medieval Italy and then the much more gritty and realistic version of medieval Italy in terms of the production design in this film from 1986. This is the Warner Brothers DVD, which has a couple nice extras, but unfortunately the Blu-ray is long out of print, so even getting this DVD has gotten tricky and it has gotten a little on the expensive side. If you can't find the DVD or the Blu-ray and you happen to have a working player, you can also get the lovely 90s Laserdisc release. This is the widescreen edition. This can be found, but it also itself is kind of uncommon. But I hate to suggest a film that's hard to find or is out of print, but it is literally the only major film I could think of besides Flame of the Arrow that was really perfect for the setting and also was relatively well known, and also a film that I actually had a copy of. So that again, it is much harder to think of titles for a much more highly specific period and place setting. And again, I'm sure there are several other films that I'm just not aware of or haven't thought of or don't have a copy of to physically show you, but these were the two films that I thought were most appropriate that I could go over and were relatively available, although again, the Name of the Rose is unfortunately out of print now. So those are my two film supplementary programs for the two exhibits at the Frist Art Museum. Again, you can see these exhibits through the end of this month and the beginning of January. The Art Deco one, I believe, closes January 2nd, and then the Medieval Italy one closes on January the 30th. So you will have to act sooner rather than later if you're in the area of the museum or plan to be visiting anytime soon. But these exhibits, I do believe, will be touring other places in the U.S., and I think they have been a few other places as well. So if you don't get to the museum or you're not able to see them here, you can probably see them other places or wherever they eventually wind up in their original home museums. But this was just something I wanted to try as perhaps an experiment since I looked at these two exhibits and they got some ideas flowing around in my head, because of course I can't go anywhere and not think of films somehow. That's just how my head works. So I started just bouncing around ideas and wound up writing a substantial Art Deco program and had to whittle it down into something a little more manageable. So these were just some general suggestions and things I thought might be very complementary to the two exhibits. So that's why I put this video together, and I hope it's been informative and fun, and hopefully you get something out of watching these films if you get the chance to see these exhibits. And if not, you can look at these films simply for the theme idea alone and see what you can get out of that. Again, these are just general suggestions and things that I came up with that I thought made great pairings, and I tried to also convey the best means of looking at these titles and which discs are the best options. All of these are available, again, except for Name of the Rose is the one that is out of print. It is obtainable, but it will take a little bit of doing, and you will have to pay a little bit more depending on which format you're trying to find it on. But it is a good film and very worthy, and again, really the notable medieval Italian film in the English language that I can think of from the relatively more modern era, because again, it's a very specific time period, so it's not like there's a whole lot of medieval Italian films out there. But again, I just wanted to throw this together as sort of an experiment just to see if I could and see what it would turn out like. So thanks ever so much for watching, and try checking out some of these films and see what you think.